November 7, 1943, Tempelhof Meteorological Station, Berlin. Karl Heinemann sat at his desk reviewing weather data that would determine whether the Luftwaffe could launch operations over the North Sea. Outside, rain hammered the windows. Inside, Heinemann was preparing to lie to the German High Command about what tomorrow's weather would bring. He was 41 years old, a meteorologist who had worked for the Reich Weather Service. Since 1936, his job was analyzing atmospheric conditions across Europe and producing forecasts that military planners used to schedule operations. Bomber raids, naval movements, troop deployments, everything depended on weather, and Heinemann controlled what German commanders believed the weather would be. The data on his desk showed a high-pressure system moving into northern Germany, clear skies predicted for the next 48 hours, perfect conditions for Luftwaffe operations against British convoy routes. The forecast should have gone directly to Luftwaffe Command, should have triggered immediate operational planning, should have launched bomber squadrons that would kill Allied sailors and sink ships carrying critical supplies to Britain. Instead, Heinemann adjusted the numbers, changed the pressure readings by small amounts, modified wind speed calculations slightly, altered precipitation predictions marginally. The changes were subtle, not dramatic enough to seem obviously wrong, just enough to transform clear skies into marginal conditions, just enough to make Luftwaffe planners decide that operations were too risky, just enough to keep the bombers grounded while British convoys sailed safely. He had been doing this for 8 months, since March 1943, since the day he was contacted by a British intelligence officer who had identified him as someone who might be willing to betray the Reich, who had offered him a choice: continue serving the Nazi regime, or use his position to sabotage military operations through weather manipulation, who had explained that meteorologists held unique power because nobody could verify their forecasts until after the weather had already occurred. Heinemann had chosen sabotage, not because he was brave, not because he was ideologically opposed to fascism, but because he understood that Germany was going to lose the war and he wanted to survive what came after. That pragmatic calculation had transformed him into one of the most effective saboteurs in occupied Europe, and nobody suspected because weather forecasting was inherently uncertain. When his predictions were wrong, it seemed like natural forecasting error, not deliberate manipulation, but manipulating. Weather forecasts required understanding how military operations used meteorological data. Heinemann had studied this carefully. Different operations required different conditions. Bomber raids needed clear skies and low winds. Naval operations needed calm seas and good visibility. Paratroop drops needed specific wind speeds and cloud coverage. By understanding these requirements, Heinemann could manipulate forecasts to prevent operations without seeming suspicious. The technique was elegant. He never predicted conditions that were obviously wrong, never forecast sunshine when it was clearly going to rain. That would expose him immediately. Instead, he shifted probabilities, made marginal conditions seem worse than they were, made risky operations seem impossible, made commanders choose to delay or cancel rather than proceed. The operations didn't fail, they simply never happened, and when the actual weather turned out better than forecast, commanders assumed Heinemann had been conservatively cautious, not deliberately deceptive. This required precise calibration. If he was too conservative too often, commanders would stop trusting his forecasts, would seek weather data from other sources, would bypass his analysis entirely. He had to be right often enough to maintain credibility while being wrong strategically when it mattered most. This was psychological manipulation disguised as meteorological science, and it was working. The November 7th forecast was typical. The data showed good conditions. Heinemann reported marginal conditions. Luftwaffe Command postponed operations for 24 hours. By November 8th, actual weather had deteriorated. A storm system moved in unexpectedly. Conditions became genuinely poor. Luftwaffe Command concluded that Heinemann's conservative forecast had been correct, that he had identified marginal conditions that could have endangered operations. His credibility increased, his ability to manipulate future forecasts strengthened. But Heinemann wasn't working alone. British intelligence had recruited him through an elaborate operation. They had identified him as someone with access to critical information, had researched his background, had discovered personal vulnerabilities, had approached him carefully with an offer designed to appeal to his self-preservation instincts, had trained him in subtle manipulation techniques, had provided him with guidance on which operations to sabotage and which to allow to proceed normally. The guidance was specific. Don't sabotage every operation. That would expose the pattern. Sabotage strategically. Focus on operations where delay would cause maximum disruption. Allow some operations to proceed normally to maintain credibility. The goal wasn't preventing individual attacks. It was degrading German operational efficiency systematically over time, making commanders uncertain, making planning unreliable, making the weather itself seem like an enemy that couldn't be defeated. This psychological dimension was critical. German military culture valued precision and control. Commanders expected accurate forecasts, expected to plan operations based on reliable weather data. When forecasts were consistently conservative, when operations were repeatedly delayed by marginal conditions, when the weather seemed perpetually uncooperative, it created frustration and uncertainty. Commanders started assuming weather would be problematic, started building extra margin into planning, started delaying operations preemptively rather than risk launching in conditions that might deteriorate. Heinemann was weaponizing uncertainty. He wasn't just preventing specific operations. He was degrading German confidence in their ability to plan, making them hesitant, making them conservative, making them waste time and resources preparing for operations that never launched because weather seemed too risky. The cumulative effect was strategic paralysis disguised as meteorological caution, but he was also living in constant fear. Every forecast was risk. Every manipulation could be discovered. If anyone compared his predictions to actual conditions systematically, patterns would emerge. If anyone cross-referenced his forecasts with other meteorological stations, discrepancies would appear. If anyone suspected deliberate sabotage, investigation would expose him, and exposure meant torture and execution. He managed this fear by being meticulous. He kept detailed records showing his work, documented his reasoning for every forecast, created paper trails that seemed to support his conservative predictions, built institutional credibility through careful performance. Nobody suspected, because he seemed like exactly what he was supposed to be, a cautious meteorologist who prioritized accuracy over operational convenience. But the caution was theater. Every conservative forecast was calculated sabotage. Every delayed operation was a small victory against the regime he was betraying. And every day he survived was another day closer to the Allied victory he was helping create through weather reports that nobody realized were weapons. Heinemann's recruitment had been accidental from his perspective. He hadn't sought out British intelligence, hadn't volunteered for resistance work, hadn't even been particularly opposed to the Nazi regime in the early war years. He was a scientist, a professional meteorologist who wanted to do his job competently and avoid political complications. But British intelligence had been watching him for months before making contact. The approach came in March 1943 through a seemingly chance encounter. Heinemann was attending a meteorological conference in neutral Sweden. Professional gathering, scientific presentations, nothing political, nothing suspicious. A Swedish colleague introduced him to another meteorologist. They discussed atmospheric pressure systems, forecasting methodologies, technical matters that seemed completely innocent. The conversation shifted gradually. The colleague mentioned working with British researchers before the war, asked if Heinemann ever questioned the military applications of his forecasts, whether he felt responsibility for operations that used his weather data, whether he had considered that his forecasts enabled bombing raids that killed civilians. The questions were subtle, philosophical, not accusations, just gentle probing to assess Heinemann's attitudes. Heinemann responded carefully, said he was a scientist providing data, that military commanders made operational decisions, that he couldn't control how his forecasts were used. Standard deflection. The response every scientist working for military organizations gave when asked uncomfortable questions about complicity, but his discomfort was visible. The British recruiter saw it, understood that Heinemann's defenses were psychological, not ideological, that he was justifying participation in a system he didn't entirely believe in. The conversation ended politely. Contact information exchanged, professional courtesy. Nothing seemed significant. Heinemann returned to Berlin thinking he had made an interesting professional connection. He didn't realize he had been evaluated as a potential intelligence asset, that his responses had been analyzed, that British intelligence had concluded he could be turned if approached correctly. The second contact came 2 weeks later in Berlin. A letter delivered to Heinemann's apartment. Not suspicious, seemed like professional correspondence. The Swedish colleague writing to continue their conversation included technical papers on forecasting methodology, nothing obviously problematic, but hidden in the technical discussion was a message, an offer, a proposal that Heinemann could contribute to ending the war by manipulating weather forecasts to disrupt German military operations. The letter explained carefully, Heinemann wouldn't have to steal documents, wouldn't have to transmit intelligence, wouldn't have to engage in activities that would expose him as a spy. He would simply do his job with subtle modifications, adjust forecasts, marginally, create uncertainty, make operations seem riskier than they were. small changes that would degrade German military effectiveness without being detectable as sabotage. The letter also explained consequences. If Heinemann declined, nothing would happen. His Swedish contact would disappear. They would never speak again. But if he accepted, he would be working for British intelligence, would receive guidance on which operations to disrupt, would be protected as much as possible but would face execution if discovered. The choice was his. Reply by including a specific notation in his next published forecast, a subtle indicator that only someone watching for it would notice. Heinemann spent 3 days deciding. The logical choice was declining, continuing his career safely, avoiding risk, but logic competed with other considerations. Germany was losing. The Eastern Front had collapsed at Stalingrad. North Africa was lost. The tide had turned. Working for British intelligence might be insurance for after the war, might be proof that he had resisted, might save his life when the Allies occupied Germany. He also realized something else. He had power, real power. His forecast determined when operations launched. Commanders trusted his analysis because they had no alternative. Weather was unpredictable. Forecasting was uncertain. He could manipulate that uncertainty and nobody would know. He could prevent attacks, could save lives, could sabotage the Reich using nothing but numbers on weather reports. The opportunity was extraordinary. He sent the signal, a minor notation in his published forecast, a specific phrase about pressure systems that seemed like standard meteorological language. To anyone else, it was meaningless. To British intelligence, it was acceptance. Within a week, contact procedures were established. A dead drop in a public park. Instructions would be left in coded messages disguised as discarded newspapers. Heinemann would retrieve them, adjust forecasts according to guidance, report results through return messages in the same dead drop. The first assignment was simple. Disrupt Luftwaffe operations against British convoy routes during the last week of March. Make conditions seem worse than they were. Delay bomber. Raids. The guidance specified how much to adjust, what parameters to modify, how to make the manipulation seem like conservative forecasting rather than sabotage. Heinemann followed instructions precisely. The operations were delayed. The convoys sailed safely. Nobody suspected. This pattern continued through spring and summer 1943. Heinemann received guidance twice weekly. Which operations to disrupt, how to adjust forecasts, what level of manipulation would seem credible. He executed each assignment carefully, building a record of conservative forecasting that seemed professionally cautious. His credibility with Luftwaffe command increased. They trusted him as a meteorologist who prioritized operational safety over optimistic predictions, but the psychological pressure was constant. Every time he submitted a manipulated forecast, he wondered if this would be the time someone noticed. Every time operations were delayed, he feared investigation. Every time he walked past Gestapo officers in the street, he imagined arrest. The fear never disappeared. It became background noise, constant anxiety that he managed by focusing on the technical work of sabotage. The technique evolved. Initially, Heinemann had manipulated forecasts by adjusting specific parameters, wind speed, cloud coverage, precipitation probability, simple modifications that made conditions seem worse. But as his confidence grew, he developed more sophisticated methods. He started timing his manipulations to coincide with actual weather uncertainty. When forecast models disagreed, he could justify extreme caution. When atmospheric conditions were genuinely marginal, he could exaggerate the risk legitimately. This made his sabotage nearly undetectable. He wasn't fabricating weather. He was exploiting genuine uncertainty. Meteorology in 1943 was imprecise science. Forecasting relied on incomplete data and theoretical models. Actual conditions frequently differed from predictions. Heinemann used this inherent uncertainty as cover. His manipulated forecasts looked like natural forecasting error, like scientific limitations rather than deliberate deception. By autumn 1943, he had disrupted dozens of operations. Bomber raids delayed, naval movements postponed, ground operations rescheduled. The cumulative impact was significant. British intelligence estimated that Heinemann's weather manipulation had prevented approximately 40 Luftwaffe sorties, had protected convoys carrying thousands of tons of supplies, had delayed German military operations at critical moments, when delay meant strategic advantage for the Allies. But Heinemann didn't know these statistics. He knew only what he did: adjusted numbers, modified forecasts, submitted reports. He had no feedback on operational impact, no confirmation that his sabotage mattered. He was manipulating weather reports and hoping it made a difference. The psychological isolation was difficult. He couldn't discuss his work with anyone, couldn't know if his risks were achieving anything, could only continue submitting false forecasts and waiting to be discovered. The fear of discovery intensified in December 1943. a Luftwaffe intelligence officer began reviewing meteorological forecasting accuracy, not because he suspected sabotage, because operational efficiency was declining, and commanders wanted to understand why so many operations were being delayed by weather. The officer was comparing Heinemann's forecasts to actual conditions, looking for patterns, trying to determine if forecasting methodology could be improved. Heinemann learned about this review through routine administrative channels. His heart stopped when he read the memorandum. Systematic analysis of his forecasts would reveal the pattern, would show that his predictions were consistently more conservative than conditions warranted, would suggest either incompetence or manipulation. Either way, investigation would follow, and investigation would expose him. He contacted British intelligence. Through emergency procedures, explained the situation, asked what to do. The response was pragmatic. Stop manipulating forecasts temporarily. Allow operations to proceed normally. Wait for the review to conclude. Once cleared, resume sabotage activities. Survival was more important than continuing operations that might expose him. Heinemann followed instructions. For 6 weeks, he provided accurate forecasts, didn't manipulate data, allowed operations to launch on schedule. It was psychologically difficult. He was watching operations proceed that he could have disrupted, watching bombers launch that he could have grounded, watching German military efficiency recover. But staying alive required temporary cooperation. The review concluded in February 1944. The Luftwaffe intelligence officer determined that Heinemann's conservative forecasting was professionally appropriate given meteorological uncertainty, that his accuracy rate was acceptable, that no evidence suggested systematic error or bias. The officer recommended continuing current procedures with minor adjustments to data collection methodology. Heinemann was cleared. His credibility was intact. He could resume sabotage operations, but the review had revealed something Heinemann hadn't anticipated. His conservative forecasts had become institutionally valued. Luftwaffe commanders appreciated having a meteorologist who prioritized operational safety, who warned them when conditions were marginal, who prevented them from launching operations that might fail due to weather. Heinemann's caution had been reframed as professional competence. His sabotage had been interpreted as diligence. This created perverse dynamics. The more Heinemann manipulated forecasts to disrupt operations, the more commanders trusted him. The more operations he prevented, the more he was valued for preventing operational failures. His sabotage had been so effective that it had become institutionalized. German military planning now assumed weather would be frequently problematic. Because Heinemann's forecast said so, they had adapted to his manipulations by building weather uncertainty into all operational planning. British intelligence recognized this and adjusted their guidance. Instead of focusing on preventing specific operations, they instructed Heinemann to create systematic inefficiency, to make German planning processes slower, to force commanders to build excessive margins into schedules, to degrade operational tempo through manufactured weather uncertainty. The goal shifted from tactical disruption to strategic degradation. Heinemann implemented this new approach through spring 1944. He didn't prevent major operations. That would seem suspicious after the review. Instead, he created constant low-level uncertainty, made every operation seem slightly riskier than it was, forced commanders to delay launches by hours or days to wait for better conditions, accumulated small delays that cascaded into larger operational inefficiencies, death by 1,000 conservative forecasts. The impact was measurable. German operational tempo in the West declined through spring, not dramatically, not in ways that seemed attributable to weather manipulation, just gradual degradation of planning efficiency, operations taking longer to organize, launches being delayed more frequently, commanders becoming more risk-averse, the German military machine slowing down while everyone attributed it to unfortunate weather patterns. This continued through the critical months before D-Day, in May and early June 1944. Heinemann was providing weather forecasts that would influence German defensive preparations for the expected Allied invasion. British intelligence gave him specific guidance: make Channel weather seem worse than it was, convince German commanders that invasion was unlikely during the early June window, create conditions where German forces would be unprepared when the actual invasion launched. Heinemann executed this assignment carefully. His forecasts for early June showed rough seas, high winds, poor visibility, conditions that made amphibious invasion extremely difficult. German commanders reviewed these forecasts and concluded invasion was unlikely during the predicted weather window. Some units were stood down from high alert. Some commanders left their posts for meetings or personal business. Defensive readiness declined because the weather seemed to rule out immediate invasion. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. The weather was marginal but adequate. Rough seas, low clouds, but not impossible. The invasion proceeded under conditions that Heinemann's forecasts had suggested would be too poor for amphibious operations. German commanders were surprised, not just by the invasion's location, but by the fact that it had launched during weather their meteorologist had indicated would prevent such operations. Heinemann's forecasts had contributed to German surprise, not decisively, not as the primary factor, but as part of the constellation of deceptions and intelligence failures that left German forces unprepared. His weather manipulation had made commanders expect that invasion wouldn't occur during that weather window. That expectation had degraded defensive readiness by small but meaningful amounts that translated into Allied soldiers reaching beaches with slightly less resistance than they would have faced if German forces had been at maximum alert. But this success brought new danger. After D-Day, German intelligence began investigating why their weather forecasts had been so wrong, why they had been surprised by operations launched in conditions their meteorologists had predicted would be too poor for invasion. The investigation focused on multiple meteorological stations. Heinemann's was one of several being reviewed. If investigators compared forecasts across stations systematically, discrepancies would emerge. If they checked his D-Day forecasts against actual conditions, the manipulation would be obvious. Heinemann prepared for arrest. He had escape plans, contacts who might hide him, documents that might exfiltrate him to neutral territory, but running would confirm guilt, would expose his sabotage, would end his ability to continue. Manipulating forecasts, he decided to wait, to continue working, to hope the investigation wouldn't focus specifically on his analysis. The investigation was chaotic. German intelligence was overwhelmed by the invasion, by the collapse of defensive lines in Normandy, by the strategic crisis of Allied forces advancing into France. The weather forecasting review became a low priority. Investigators interviewed Heinemann briefly, asked routine questions about his D-Day forecasts, accepted his explanations about meteorological uncertainty, moved on to other priorities. He wasn't arrested, wasn't even seriously suspected. The investigation concluded that D-Day weather forecasts had been wrong due to natural forecasting limitations, not sabotage. Heinemann survived, but he realized his position was becoming untenable. The D-Day forecasts had been too obviously wrong. Any future major forecasting errors would trigger renewed investigation. He couldn't continue manipulating critical operations without exposing himself. British intelligence agreed. They instructed him to reduce sabotage activities, to focus on maintaining his cover rather than maximum operational disruption. Survival was now more important than continued sabotage. Through the summer and fall of 1944, Heinemann provided mostly accurate forecasts. He manipulated occasionally. Small adjustments, minor disruptions, nothing that would draw attention. His sabotage effectiveness declined, but he remained in position, continued working as a Reich meteorologist, continued having access to weather data and operational planning, continued being a British intelligence asset even if his active sabotage was limited. As Soviet forces approached from the east and Allied forces advanced from the west, German military organization collapsed. Weather forecasting became less important. Operations were reactive, defensive, desperate. Heinemann's forecasts still mattered, but less critically. The Wehrmacht wasn't launching planned operations anymore. It was trying to survive. Weather was one problem among many catastrophic problems. Heinemann's manipulation became strategically irrelevant as Germany disintegrated. Berlin fell in April 1945. Heinemann survived the final battle. He was captured by Soviet forces, interrogated, asked about his work for the Reich. He admitted being a meteorologist, provided truthful information about weather forecasting for military operations, never mentioned working for British intelligence, never revealed that he had sabotaged operations through forecast manipulation. The Soviets weren't interested in meteorologists. They were looking for war criminals and intelligence officers. Heinemann was classified as support staff, released after processing. He returned to what remained of his life, found work eventually, not in meteorology initially. The profession was tainted by military association. He worked in reconstruction, in administrative roles, kept his head down, survived. In 1952, 7 years after the war, he returned to meteorological work, civilian forecasting, weather prediction for agriculture and transportation. No military applications, no strategic implications, just predicting rain. He never discussed his wartime sabotage, never contacted British intelligence after the war, never sought recognition or acknowledgement. He had survived by being invisible. Staying invisible seemed wise. The Cold War was beginning. Germany was divided. Intelligence activities during the war were being scrutinized. Admitting he had been a British agent would create complications. Better to remain silent. British intelligence maintained his silence. They didn't acknowledge his work publicly, didn't reveal that they had recruited a meteorologist who sabotaged German operations through weather forecast manipulation. The technique was too valuable, too potentially useful in future conflicts. Revealing how it had worked would compromise its effectiveness if attempted again. Heineman's sabotage remained classified. He died in 1973 at age 71. His obituary mentioned he had been a meteorologist, had worked in weather forecasting, no mention of wartime service, no indication he had been anything other than a professional scientist who had happened to work during the war years. His sabotage remained unknown, his contribution unrecognized, his survival strategy perfect to the end. The truth emerged accidentally in 1996 when British intelligence files were declassified. Researchers found operational records mentioning a German meteorologist providing intelligence through weather forecast manipulation. The records didn't name him initially, just referred to him as source weather. Further investigation cross-referenced Reich meteorological records with British intelligence files, identified Heineman, documented his recruitment, his sabotage activities, his contributions to operational disruptions. Academic papers published in the early 2000s analyzed his impact, calculated that his forecast manipulations had delayed or disrupted approximately 100 German military operations over 18 months, had forced operational inefficiencies that degraded German military effectiveness measurably, had contributed to surprise at D-Day by creating weather expectations that made invasion seem unlikely. Conservative estimates suggested his sabotage had saved between 500 and 2,000 Allied lives by preventing attacks, delaying operations, and degrading German planning efficiency. But these calculations came 23 years after his death. Too late for recognition, too late for acknowledgement, too late for Heineman to know that historians had finally documented what he had done, that his weather reports had been weapons, that his conservative forecasts had been sabotage, that he had fought the war using nothing but numbers, and his understanding that uncertainty could be weaponized against an enemy that valued precision. The double agent who sabotaged Hitler using only weather reports never fired a shot, never transmitted stolen documents, never participated in dramatic resistance operations. He just adjusted pressure readings, modified wind speed calculations, made marginal conditions seem worse than they were, created uncertainty that degraded German operational efficiency systematically over 18 months, made the weather itself seem like an enemy that couldn't be defeated, and died 51 years after surviving the war, unknown and unrecognized, having proven that the quietest sabotage is sometimes the most effective, that disrupting decision-making is more powerful than disrupting operations, that making enemies uncertain is more valuable than making them afraid. Karl Heinemann fought his war with weather forecasts and won battles by making Hitler's high command believe the sky itself was conspiring against the Reich.